In the quiet spaces of my mind, I often wonder about the moments where life shifted. Small, seemingly insignificant actions that eventually tore at the fabric of my marriage. 10 years, a decade, with the woman I had built my world around, and yet there were cracks, subtle and so tiny that only over time revealed the vast chasm beneath. The truth, when it finally came to light, was a heavy weight, an overwhelming force. But for now, I speak of the journey, how I arrived at the understanding of it all. It was in the evenings, when the day's exhaustion set into my bones, that the first inkling of doubt surfaced. She, my wife, beautiful in ways that others would turn their heads to admire, had always been a constant. Her dark hair always falling perfectly around her face, the delicate curve of her smile, the laugh that had first drawn me in, soft and unassuming, the kind that made everything feel like a secret we were sharing. I often recall the way she would stand near the kitchen counter in the mornings, making her tea, looking out the window, her movements deliberate and fluid. We lived in a home that should have been filled with the sound of joy, the sound of love. But the silence of our days, the way our conversations gradually lost their spark, felt like the first tremors of an earthquake, quiet and unnoticeable at first, until the ground beneath me gave way entirely. I had always been the quiet type, introspective, keeping my thoughts to myself. I didn't speak about the small things, the moments that felt slightly off, the way she sometimes looked at her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, her smile, just a little too quick to be genuine. But in the very marrow of my bones, I felt it. Something was slipping away. It wasn't one monumental thing, no grand revelation that broke everything open. It was instead a series of small moments that together revealed the cracks that had been hidden for so long. The first real confrontation came unexpectedly. I had been away on a business trip, a short one, just a few days, but enough time for me to sense an unfamiliar tension in the air when I returned. She greeted me at the door, her smile just as bright, but her eyes were somewhere else. It was the smallest thing, her gaze darting away just a fraction of a second before I could catch it. But the feeling that followed lingered, like a shadow. I didn't press it. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I waited, unsure, unable to believe the suspicions that crept up in the quiet moments of reflection. I tried to hold on to the image of her I had always cherished, but with every passing day, something new chipped away at it. Late nights at work became the norm. Texts and calls that she wouldn't share, an almost imperceptible detachment in the way she touched me, as if she were no longer certain of how to be close. The distance was widening, like the slow ebb of a tide, and I couldn't stop it. There was a weight in my chest, a suffocating realization that I could no longer ignore, and yet I still couldn't bring myself to confront her directly. The silence between us was a language in itself, and it was in that silence that I found myself unraveling. It wasn't just the knowledge, the growing awareness of what was happening. It was the self-doubt, the crippling thought that somehow it was my fault. Had I been too distant? Too preoccupied? Had I not been enough? In my mind, I grappled with these questions, trying to decipher the subtle signs. The warmth between us, once as natural as breathing, felt forced now. I watched her movements with increasing attention, the way she would turn away quickly when I entered a room, or how her laughter would falter if I made a joke, as if it weren't quite the same. It came crashing down one evening, after a particularly long day at work. I came home, tired, my thoughts scattered. I found her sitting in the living room, her back to the door, her phone in hand. I didn't expect her to be so startled when I entered, but she jumped as if caught in a lie. There was a fleeting panic in her eyes before she masked it with a smile. That's when I knew. The truth, no matter how delicately it's unveiled, never comes without its sting. I asked her, quietly, almost too quietly, as though afraid of the answer, "Is there something you need to tell me?" She didn't look at me at first, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. There was a moment of hesitation. Then, with a voice that trembled just enough to betray her, she whispered, "I never wanted to hurt you." And just like that, the dam broke. In that moment, I was caught between disbelief and fury. The words didn't matter. Not anymore. The realization that she had kept this from me for so long, that for 10 years I had lived in a house built on lies, shattered something deep within me. My mind raced with the faces of all the years we'd spent together, now viewed through a veil of betrayal. The days that followed her confession felt like a blur, a haze of conflicting emotions that left me disoriented, as though I were drifting through a dream I couldn't wake from. I didn't know what to do with myself, with the space around me, with her. Every corner of our home, the place we'd built together, full of memories and whispered promises, felt foreign. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, barely able to touch anything without feeling the weight of what had happened. She apologized repeatedly, her voice soft, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine regret. She cried, of course, but somehow it felt hollow, as if her tears were more for herself than for the pain she'd caused me. Could I ever believe her again? Could those tears ever wash away the hurt she had left in her wake? I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if I wanted her comfort, her proximity, or if I just wanted her gone. The space between us, once filled with laughter, affection, and warmth, was now a chasm I could not cross. Her presence was suffocating, her apologies more like a litany of reminders that we had become strangers. But still, in the quiet of our home, I found myself looking at her, just looking, really, as if seeing her for the first time. She wasn't the woman I thought I knew. She wasn't the person I had married. Her betrayal had stripped away the illusion I'd held of her, of us, leaving only the bare bones of the relationship we had once shared. "Do you love him?" I asked one evening, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like a weight neither of us wanted to acknowledge. She looked at me then, her lips trembling, her hands fidgeting in her lap, avoiding my gaze. I don't know," she finally admitted, her voice shaking. The honesty in her words, raw and unfiltered, was almost harder to bear than the lie I'd lived for so long. She didn't know? Her eyes met mine finally, and in them I saw something unfamiliar, a depth of uncertainty, of guilt. It was like looking at a person who was drowning, their eyes wide with desperation, but with no idea how to ask for help. I couldn't breathe. The pain of hearing her say those words, "I don't know," cut through me like a knife. How could she not know? How could she stand there and say that, knowing what she had done to me, to us? "I don't know if I love him," she repeated, as if trying to convince herself more than me. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to happen, and I regret it every day, but I was lost. I didn't know what I needed, and by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Her words felt like a slow poison, sinking deep into my chest, spreading outward. Lost. Regret. Was I supposed to feel sympathy? Was I supposed to feel compassion? Or was I, in the end, just another casualty in her search for something she couldn't quite name? "I don't understand," I muttered almost to myself. My eyes fell to my hands, the same hands that had held hers during the happiest moments of our life together. Those hands now felt cold and unfamiliar. "I don't either," she whispered, her voice breaking. For days, we existed in this limbo, walking around each other like we were both afraid of what might break if we touched too much. I spent hours staring out the window, thinking about what had gone wrong, about how I had missed the signs, how I had let the little things slip by unnoticed. In the deep silence of the nights, when the weight of everything grew too heavy to bear, I would question myself. Was it my fault? Had I not been enough? Had I not seen her suffering, her unhappiness? But even then, beneath the swirling doubt, there was a part of me that knew. This wasn't my fault. I hadn't caused this. The betrayal, the secrets, they were hers to own. But still, the bitterness of it gnawed at me, like a wound that refused to heal. The first real moment of change came on a cold, quiet morning. She was in the kitchen, making coffee as she always did, her back to me. I had just gotten out of bed, still exhausted from the nights of restless sleep. There was a strange stillness to the room, the kind that signals the shift of something fundamental. "I think I need to go," I said, the words barely forming on my lips. But as soon as I said them, a sense of clarity flooded through me, a strange calmness that settled into my bones. I wasn't sure where I would go, what I would do, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Her back stiffened. I saw her shoulders tense, as though she had been waiting for this moment but still wasn't prepared for it. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with surprise. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, like she couldn't quite believe it. "I need to figure out who I am now," I said. The words tasted foreign, but they were true. I need to find myself again, without you. There was a silence, a heavy pause where I felt everything hanging in the balance. The days that followed felt like a constant blur between numbness and longing. I moved through the motions, still in the same house, but it no longer felt like home. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on me, the weight of memories pressing down with every step. Every room, every corner reminded me of what we had lost, of the version of me that had died the moment the truth was revealed. I stayed in the house for a few days after I told her I needed space. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. In fact, it felt like the only option left to me. The familiar ache of a broken heart was only compounded by the echo of silence between us. I hadn't truly left her, not in the physical sense, but there was a kind of distance now that no one could cross. My own hands seemed unfamiliar to me, as though they weren't mine to use anymore, as though they no longer held the same tenderness. She tried, of course. She tried to reach me, to offer me comfort, to remind me of all that we had shared. But it felt empty, like trying to pour water into a glass with cracks too wide to hold it. I would find her in the kitchen, her back to me as she went through the motions of making dinner, her hands trembling just slightly, though she hid it well. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, almost apologetic, but there was a tinge of desperation in it now, a desperate need for redemption, for forgiveness. "Do you want me to cook you something?" she would ask. And when I didn't respond, when I merely shook my head, she would fall silent again, her eyes brimming with tears she wouldn't let fall. I, too, had my moments, when the pain of seeing her struggle, seeing her feel the weight of what she had done, pulled at something deep inside me. There was love still, underneath the betrayal, a love that was bruised and battered but not entirely gone. Yet every time I looked at her, I remembered. She was the one who had hurt me. She was the one who had chosen someone else. The hardest part was the quiet moments when she wasn't there, when I found myself alone with my thoughts. That was when the loneliness truly set in. The house felt colder then, and the emptiness inside me felt deeper, as though it were a cavern I had been falling into for years and never noticed. I began to realize that I wasn't just grieving the woman I had loved. I was grieving the life I had built around her. I was grieving the person I had been before I found out the truth, the man who had trusted without hesitation, who had believed in the illusion of forever. It was a week later, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, when I finally left. I didn't want to be there any longer, not even for a moment. I packed my things, just a few bags at first, small, inconsequential things that didn't mean anything, not compared to what I was leaving behind, and stepped out into the cool night air. The door shut behind me with a finality that echoed through the hollow space I had once called home. I had no destination, no clear plan. I simply needed to get away. The city felt too small, too familiar. I needed the unknown. I needed to lose myself, even if just for a while, before I could even begin to think about the future. The first few nights were a blur of empty hotel rooms and the sharp sting of loneliness. I stayed in places that were nothing special, dimly lit, shabby rooms with flickering lamps and faded curtains. The world outside felt vast, as if I were a speck in an ocean of strangers, anonymous and free. But even in the anonymity, the silence weighed on me. In those moments, I found myself reflecting. Not on the betrayal, not on her choices, but on my own. I began to realize something that had been buried deep within me. I had let the pain take over. I had let myself drown in it. And while it was valid, while it was justified, it was no longer enough. I could not remain in this place of suffering forever. The days began to stretch on, and eventually, I sought out small moments of peace. I took long walks through the city, allowing myself to wander aimlessly, just breathing in the unfamiliar scents, listening to the hum of life around me. I found solace in the mundane, the sound of the city at dawn, the chatter of strangers, the way the sun hit the sidewalks in the morning, painting everything in gold. There was something about these simple moments that made the chaos inside me feel more manageable, as if they were offering me a glimmer of clarity. I was reminded that the world was still turning, that there were things beyond the painful cocoon I had wrapped myself in. Eventually, I found a place to settle, a small apartment, far away from the life I had known. It was bare at first, just 4 walls and a few pieces of furniture. But in that emptiness, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. It was a strange feeling, as though the weight had finally been lifted, even if just for a moment. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, each passing with its own rhythm. The days were sometimes long and heavy, filled with thoughts that weighed me down, but the nights, those were the hardest. It was in the stillness of the dark, in the quiet hum of the city outside my window, that the old pain would creep back in, silent but insistent. It was during those hours that I'd remember things, small details, moments that had felt perfect, yet now seemed so distant. The sound of her laughter, the way her fingers brushed against mine as we walked together, the soft murmur of her voice when she said, "I love you." But the sting of the betrayal had softened, little by little. Time had made its mark, and with it, I had learned to breathe again, to be alone without drowning in it. I would often take long walks in the evening, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, letting the rhythm of my footsteps guide me forward. I had become familiar with the city, its noises, its quirks, its secret corners, and in a way, the city became a reflection of me. Like me, it was scarred, but it was still standing, still alive. I found solace in the mundane, in the small things that now had new meaning, like the way the coffee shop smelled in the morning, rich and warm, the steady clink of cups as people went about their lives, or how, on rainy days, the streets would glisten with the soft sheen of wet pavement, the world softened and blurred by the mist. These were the things that reminded me that life still held beauty, even when it didn't feel easy, even when it didn't feel whole. There were days when I would let myself remember her. I would see her face in my mind, her warm brown eyes, the way she had tilted her head when she was listening to me speak. I could still feel the way her hand had once fit perfectly in mine. It would hurt, briefly, but it wasn't the searing pain it had been before. I had learned to make peace with it, not as a way of accepting the betrayal, but as a way of releasing the hold it had over me. And then came the day when I was ready to let go for good. It happened without warning. One ordinary evening, I was walking home from the market, a bag of groceries in hand, the faint sound of laughter echoing in the street around me. I had been thinking about nothing in particular when I walked past a familiar corner, a corner I'd walked down countless times with her, the one just outside the small park near our old apartment. It was the place where we used to stop every Sunday afternoon to watch the children play, to sit on the bench and talk about the future. I paused there, standing still, the memory rushing back with such clarity that it took me by surprise. For a long moment, I just stood there, breathing in the cool evening air, letting the weight of it all wash over me. And then, in the middle of that silence, I realized something profound. I had no desire to go back. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It wasn't about healing the wound she had inflicted. It was about me. It was about the fact that I had finally found my footing, that I had started to rebuild my own life, not for her, not for anyone, but for myself. The pain still existed, yes, but it no longer defined me. I could have stood there longer, caught in the swirl of nostalgia and loss, but instead I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs, and I kept walking, one step after another, leaving the past behind me, with no more regrets, no more bitterness. I began to truly embrace the freedom I had earned. I started small projects, things I'd always wanted to do but had put aside for a relationship that had ultimately not been right for me. I took up painting again, something I had loved as a child but had forgotten in the busy years of adulthood. It was clumsy at first, my strokes rough and uncertain, but it was a step, a symbolic step back into who I was before the heartbreak, before the disillusionment. I reconnected with old friends, ones I had distanced myself from when I'd been wrapped up in my relationship. We shared stories and laughter, moments that reminded me that there was more to life than the heartache I had left behind. And then, one day, as I was walking through the same park, I bumped into her. It was unexpected, a collision of two worlds, mine, which had grown and shifted, and hers, which seemed to have stayed frozen in time. She looked different, older in a way, her face marked by the years since we last spoke. There was a hesitation in her eyes when she saw me, a fleeting moment of uncertainty, as if she didn't know what to say, how to act. I felt no anger, no desire to lash out. In that moment, I realized I had moved on. I had let go. The weight of the years spent grieving her betrayal had lifted. I wasn't the man I had been, and neither was she. We were two separate beings now, shaped by different choices, different paths. "Hey," I said, my voice calm, steady. The next few months passed like waves on the shore, some gentle, some crashing with unexpected force, but each one moving me forward. In a way, I had begun to rebuild, piece by piece, not just the life I had lost, but the person I had forgotten along the way. It was as though the old me, the one who had once known joy without fear, had been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to emerge. The cracks in my heart, though still present, were no longer deep enough to swallow me whole. I filled my days with little things that had once brought me peace, long walks through the park, where I'd rediscovered the sound of birds singing, the feel of grass beneath my feet, the sun kissing my skin. I had forgotten how to just be in the world, how to appreciate the beauty of small moments. And then came her letter. It arrived on a rainy afternoon, the kind of day when everything felt heavy. Gray skies, the soft tapping of rain against the windows. The envelope was plain, simple even, and yet the moment I saw it, I knew who it was from. Her handwriting, still the same as I remembered it, sharp, elegant, with the careful loops of someone who took their time to choose each word. I sat on the couch, the letter unopened in my hands, my fingers tracing the edges of the paper. For a long time, I didn't know what to do with it. Was I ready for this? Was I ready to open that door, even if it was just a crack? "I'm not the same person I was when I left," I reminded myself, taking a slow breath. "I've moved on." But even as I said it to myself, I knew I had to read it. I had to know what she wanted. So, with a mixture of hesitation and curiosity, I opened the letter. "Dear, your name." The words on the page were simple, but they carried a weight I wasn't prepared for. Her voice came rushing back with every sentence, as though it had never truly left. I know this letter is probably the last thing you expected to receive from me, and I'm sure you have every right to feel angry, confused, or even indifferent. I have spent so many months thinking about the pain I caused you, and how nothing I can say or do will ever make up for it. I hurt you, and I have to live with that every day. But I've learned so much about myself in the time we've been apart. I thought I could keep pretending that everything was okay, that I could hide from my own mistakes. But the truth is, I was never the person I wanted to be with you, and I have spent so long running from that. I know you probably don't need or want an apology, and I understand if you don't even want to hear from me again. But I want you to know that I see my flaws, and I see the hurt I caused you. And I hope one day you can forgive me, for my own sake, as much as yours. The words stung. They felt like salt being poured into an open wound, and yet they didn't feel like they came from the same person I had known. This was not the woman I had once loved, who had turned her back on me. No, this was someone else. Someone who had gone through her own journey of reflection, of growth, perhaps even of regret. And yet there was still a part of me that couldn't let go of the anger, that couldn't push aside the betrayal. She had left me behind once. What if this was just another attempt to reclaim something she had lost? But this is not about me anymore, I reminded myself. It's about her. It's about her own healing. I folded the letter back up and set it on the table, the words lingering in the air between us. My chest felt tight, like a knot that couldn't be untied, and my mind raced with the question of whether I should respond. But in that moment, I realized that I didn't need to respond. I had already answered the question without saying a word. I had forgiven her in the only way I knew how, by moving forward, by letting go of the weight she had placed on me. There was nothing she could say now that would change that. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting by the window, watching the rain fall in sheets. It felt peaceful, somehow, like the world was washing away the last remnants of the past. My thoughts kept drifting back to the letter, to the woman who had written it, but each time they did, they were quieter, fainter. Her words were no longer the source of my pain. They were simply another piece of the past, something I would carry with me, but not something that would define me. In the weeks that followed, I didn't reach out to her. I didn't feel the need to. I had found the closure I needed, not in her words, but in my own choices. I let myself embrace the truth that I had come so far, and that my path was no longer intertwined with hers. I started to put more effort into the things that made me happy: art, music, even just sitting in a park on a lazy afternoon. I went on dates with people who had never known the old me, people who saw me for who I was now, not the man who had been betrayed, but the man who had found his way back from the edge. Months slipped by like the pages of a well-worn book, each day unfolding into the next with a quiet assurance. I had come to understand something crucial about myself. Healing wasn't a linear process. It didn't happen overnight. It was made up of small, subtle victories and sometimes quiet losses. And for the first time in years, I felt whole again. Not the person I had been, not the one who had loved and lost, but someone entirely new. Someone who had found peace in their own skin. One particular evening, as the sun dipped low and the golden light wrapped itself around the corners of the world, I found myself walking through the city's streets, my thoughts wandering with no destination in mind. It had become a ritual, these evening walks, a way to clear my head, to check in with myself. The cool air caressed my face, and the city felt alive, buzzing with life, with stories, with possibility. As I turned a corner, I noticed a familiar figure up ahead, someone I hadn't seen in what felt like a lifetime. It was her. She was standing at the entrance of a small cafe, the kind of place that had once been our favorite spot. She was looking at the menu outside, her fingers absent-mindedly twirling a strand of her hair, her face softened by the gentle light of the street lamp. For a moment I stood still, just watching her, as if I could somehow capture this fleeting moment in time. This instance of two people who had once been so close, now existing on opposite sides of a story. I debated whether to approach her, to say something, but I hesitated. What would I even say? The words that came to mind felt inadequate. There was no need for any grand speeches or forced pleasantries. The truth was, we had both changed, and what we had shared was no longer something that needed to be revived. It was a chapter that had ended long ago, and that was okay. But then, as though sensing my presence, she looked up. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief, silent moment, we just stood there. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just two people acknowledging each other in the quiet rhythm of the world around them. "Hey," she said, her voice tentative but not uncertain. "Hey," I replied, my words coming easily, as if there had never been a gap in time between us. We exchanged a glance, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the weight of the past pressing on me. There was no bitterness, no anger, just calm. "Long time no see," she said, her lips curving into a soft smile. It was a smile I remembered well, but this time it felt different, more sincere, less burdened. "Yeah," I agreed, nodding slightly. "How have you been?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping to the pavement before meeting my eyes again. "I've been finding my way, I guess," she said quietly. "It's been a journey, but I think I'm getting there." I studied her for a moment. She looked different, not just in the way she carried herself, but in the way she spoke, as if she had learned something important about herself along the way. She wasn't the woman I had once known, but she wasn't a stranger either. There was a familiarity in the way she held herself, in the way her hands moved when she spoke, in the way she avoided eye contact for just a moment before letting herself be seen. "Good," I said, and for the first time in a long while, I meant it. "I'm glad to hear that." There was a pause, and in the stillness, I felt the pull of nostalgia, of everything that we had once been. It wasn't pain that washed over me, but something deeper, something more complicated. It was the feeling of two people who had loved and lost and grown. We had both been through things that had shaped us, things that had been out of our control, and here we were, standing on opposite sides of it all. "I never meant to hurt you," she said after a beat, her voice low, her words almost a whisper against the backdrop of the world. "I know I can never make it right, but I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. Truly." The sincerity in her words settled into me, a quiet echo of everything I had felt for so long. I had spent so much time trying to understand why, trying to piece together the puzzle of her actions, but now it didn't matter. It was over. She had said her piece and I had let go. "It's okay," I said, my voice steady, the weight of the past lifting off me with each word. "We both made mistakes. And we've learned from them. That's what matters." She nodded, her gaze softening. For a moment, we stood in comfortable silence, the years between us stretched thin, like an old, worn-out blanket. "I should get going," she said finally, her voice taking on a hesitant edge. "Yeah, me too," I agreed. And just like that, we both took a step back, acknowledging the distance between us, the quiet understanding that we were no longer the people who had shared a life together. But as I turned to walk away, I realized something. The days that followed that evening seemed to unfold with a kind of quiet grace, as if the universe, in its own way, had decided to allow me a moment of clarity. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore, not the kind I had once yearned for. No, it was something deeper, something more profound. it was acceptance. I had accepted not only what had happened between us, but also who I had become because of it. But as much as I wanted to let the past go, there were moments when the world would slip and reveal little cracks, tiny reminders that I wasn't quite as far from it as I thought. Some days, I would catch myself lost in thought, my mind tracing the paths we had once walked together, the late-night talks and the quiet mornings. And though I knew better than to linger too long in the past, there were times when it was hard not to. It was on one of those days, while I was sitting alone in my favorite cafe, a place I had claimed as my own sanctuary since the end of everything, that I saw her again. She wasn't looking at me this time, but I knew it was her the moment she stepped inside. Her silhouette, tall and graceful, moved with a quiet kind of certainty. She glanced around the room before her eyes finally settled on me. The recognition in her gaze was immediate, like the flicker of a flame rekindling. But there was something different this time. A softness, a gentleness in the way she looked at me, as if the weight of everything had finally lifted. She approached slowly, her footsteps hesitant, but not as uncertain as before. I could feel the shift in the air, the gentle pull between us, a magnetism that hadn't existed in the same way before. And as she stood before me, there was no awkwardness, no tension. There was simply a presence. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice warm, but tempered with a kind of respectful caution. I nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Please." She lowered herself into the seat, folding her hands neatly in front of her, her eyes meeting mine with a quiet resolve. The years, the distance, the heartbreak, it all seemed to fall away in that moment. And yet, there was still a lingering question in my mind. Why now? Why had she come back? "I've been thinking about you," she said softly, as if choosing each word with care. Her eyes were a little sad, but not in the way they had once been. This wasn't the sorrow of someone who had run from the truth, but rather someone who had embraced it, someone who had finally made peace with what had happened. "Have you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I wasn't angry, not anymore. It was more curiosity than anything else. Curiosity about her, about what had led her to this moment, and about what she wanted now. "I have," she replied, her voice steady now, though I could hear the weight of her words. "I've spent so much time reflecting on everything, on what went wrong, on what I could have done differently. And for the first time in, well, ever, I think I'm starting to understand why I did what I did, why I pushed you away, why I betrayed you." I leaned back in my chair, my fingers tracing the edge of my coffee cup, watching her as she spoke. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no attempts to justify herself, only honesty, raw, unfiltered honesty that felt almost like a relief. "I think," she continued, "I was afraid of love, afraid of commitment, afraid of being seen for who I really was. And so, I ran. I ran from the one person who was always there for me. I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my throat. I had always wondered why she had chosen to leave, to make the choices she did. But hearing her say it aloud, hearing her acknowledge the fear, the uncertainty, it was like the last piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. "I don't expect anything from you," she said quietly, her eyes flickering down to the table for a brief moment. "I don't expect you to forgive me, or to want anything to do with me again. But I needed you to know that I see what I did, and I'm sorry. Truly sorry." The apology wasn't the revelation. It wasn't the thing that shifted everything back into place, because I had already moved beyond it. But hearing it from her, knowing she had finally found the courage to admit the truth, gave me something I hadn't realized I needed. Closure. Not from her actions, but from my own heart. I sat in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of her words settle in my chest. The cafe hummed with soft conversations around us, but in that instant, the world outside seemed far away. I wasn't sure how to respond, what the right words would be. But as I looked at her, really looked at her, no longer clouded by the anger of the past, I realized something. "I don't need you to apologize," I said, my voice steady. "I've already forgiven you, in my own way. I think I always have. But it wasn't about that, you know. It was never about you asking for forgiveness." In the weeks that followed our meeting, I began to notice something stirring within me, something I had long forgotten. It was a quiet yearning, a pull toward the unknown, toward the future that had always seemed so distant. I had spent so much time wrapped up in the past, in the ghosts of what had been, that I had neglected the possibility of what could be. But now, as I moved through each day, the world felt full of promise once more, full of new beginnings. I started taking risks again, little ones at first, trying new places, meeting new people, stepping out of the familiar patterns that had once felt like safety. It was like learning how to walk all over again, each step filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. And with every step, I grew more confident, more sure of myself. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live again. One evening, about a month after our conversation, I found myself sitting in a small, dimly lit bar, nursing a drink I hadn't intended to order. I had come there to clear my head, to let the noise of the world wash over me, and it was working. The steady hum of conversation around me created a kind of soothing rhythm, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at ease. It was then that I noticed her. Someone new. She was seated at the bar, her back to me. But there was something about her posture that caught my attention. She was confident, sure of herself in a way that was both graceful and effortless. Her laughter echoed across the room, light and free, and I felt an odd pull toward her. Not in the way I had once been drawn to my ex, but something different, something gentler, less urgent. She caught my gaze as I stared, and her smile was easy, unassuming, like she'd known me forever. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a strange sense of recognition. Not that I had met her before, but that I was ready to meet someone new, to open myself up again, to feel that excitement, the possibility of something fresh. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice light, her words carrying just the right amount of curiosity. I blinked, taken slightly aback by her directness, but it didn't feel intrusive. It felt like an invitation, a gentle step into something undefined. "No, not at all," I replied, shifting over in my seat to make room. She slid onto the stool next to me with an effortless grace, her movements smooth, like water flowing across rocks. She was wearing a soft green sweater that contrasted beautifully with her dark, wavy hair, and her eyes, clear and warm, seemed to hold a depth to them, as if she had lived a life full of stories. "I haven't seen you around here before," she said, picking up her glass and swirling it slowly, watching the ice cubes clink together. Her tone was casual, but there was an undercurrent of interest in her words. "I'm new," I said, offering a half-smile. "I've been trying to get out more." "Good for you," she said, her smile widening. "I think we all need to do that, don't we? Life's too short to stay stuck." Her words struck me, like a bell ringing in the silence of my own thoughts. There was an honesty to her, a kind of simplicity that felt refreshing. It wasn't forced, wasn't trying too hard. She was just present. We fell into an easy conversation after that, the kind where words came naturally, and there was no pressure to fill every silence. She told me a little about herself, how she had recently moved to the city, how she was starting a new job, how she was still figuring things out just like everyone else. There was no pretense, no guarded walls, just a sense of two people connecting in the quiet hum of a crowded bar. As the evening wore on, I found myself feeling lighter than I had in years. There was something about her energy, her warmth, her openness, that reminded me of the beauty of human connection. She wasn't trying to fix anything, wasn't trying to fill a void. She was just there, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could just be two. When it was time to leave, neither of us rushed. We exchanged a few more words, and there was something in her smile that made me believe we would see each other again. "You're good at this," she said, standing up from her seat, talking to people, making them feel comfortable. I smiled, feeling a flush of warmth creep into my chest. "It's easier than it seems," I replied. "I think people just need someone to listen." "I'll remember that," she said, her voice carrying a hint of something that felt like an unspoken promise. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of something. "I'd like to see you again." I nodded, already knowing that I wanted the same. "I'd like that too." As I walked out of the bar that night, the city felt alive in a new way. It wasn't just the bright lights or the bustling streets. It was the feeling of possibilities, of connections, of a world waiting to be explored. And as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized something. The days following that evening began to carry a sense of warmth, as if the city itself had shifted, ever so slightly, toward something new. I wasn't sure if it was the promise of new beginnings or the simple joy of rediscovering what it meant to be open to the world, but I could feel it, a spark that had long been dormant inside me. And each time I thought of her, that woman at the bar, I felt a ripple of something unfamiliar but welcome. I saw her again a few days later. She'd messaged me, her words casual but inviting, like a gentle nudge pushing us both toward something that felt inevitable. The coffee shop we met at was small, tucked away on a quiet corner of the city, with wooden floors and the scent of roasted beans lingering in the air. It was the kind of place that felt timeless, where people could lose track of hours in conversation without realizing it. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Her eyes lit up when she saw me walk in, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. That simple, genuine smile, the kind that made me feel seen in a way that I hadn't realized I needed. "Hey," I greeted her, stepping toward the table. "Hope I didn't keep you waiting long." "No," she replied, shaking her head. "I just got here." She gestured to the empty chair across from her, a welcoming invitation. "How's your week been?" I sat down, leaning back in my chair. "Busy, but good. The city feels a little less overwhelming these days. You know, getting used to it." I smiled, feeling a bit self-conscious, as though I were explaining a secret I had just discovered. "What about you? How's the new job?" She sighed, her smile softening with a hint of exhaustion. "It's good. Challenging, but in a way that feels right, you know. I've been wanting a change for a while, but it's a lot to take in all at once." "I get that," I said, nodding. "Sometimes a change is exactly what you need. But it's never as easy as it sounds." "Exactly," she said with a light laugh, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "But, you know, I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night, about people needing someone to listen." She paused for a moment, taking a sip of her coffee before continuing. "I think I've been so focused on my own stuff for so long that I forgot what it was like to truly connect with someone, to let someone in." I felt a strange warmth in my chest at her words, like a recognition of something we both understood without having to say it aloud. It wasn't just about listening. It was about being seen, really seen, for who we were, without pretense, without judgment. "I think we all need that," I said softly, my voice steady. "Someone to remind us that we're not alone in the mess of things." She nodded, her eyes locking with mine in a way that felt intentional, meaningful. "I'm glad I met you," she said, her voice low but sincere. "I'm glad we've crossed paths." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, but the words that came out felt true. Me too. The conversation drifted between us, easy and fluid, as if we were old friends picking up where we'd left off. We talked about everything and nothing, books, music, the city, the small things that made up the rhythms of our lives. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people enjoying each other's company in the way that felt natural. As we sat there, time seemed to bend, stretching into moments that felt longer than they were. The world outside the coffee shop continued on, but in that space, it was just the two of us. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to feel present, to let go of the shadows of the past and simply enjoy the moment. When the afternoon sun began to fade, casting a soft glow across the room, she stood up, reaching for her bag. "I should get going," she said, smiling at me with a look that made my heart skip. "But I'm really glad we met up. Let's do it again sometime." "I'd like that," I said, standing as well. I paid for our drinks, a small gesture that felt right, and then followed her outside into the cool evening air. We stood for a moment on the sidewalk, just watching the world around us, the sounds of the city becoming a quiet hum in the background. "Take care," she said, her voice soft, her eyes lingering on mine just a moment longer than necessary. "You too," I replied, the words simple but full of meaning. And then, just like that, she turned and walked away, her figure slowly blending into the crowd, but leaving something behind. A sense of connection, a spark of possibility. As I stood there, watching her disappear into the distance, I felt a shift inside me. I didn't know what the future held or where this new path might lead, but I knew one thing. I was no longer afraid of it. I was no longer bound by the past, nor by the scars of what had been. The journey had only just begun, and this time, I was ready to embrace it. The days after our coffee meeting passed slowly, the hours stretching between our encounters, but each moment felt like it was building toward something. She had left an imprint on me, something light but undeniable, like a subtle melody that you couldn't quite get out of your head. I found myself replaying her words in my mind, the warmth in her smile, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of her dreams. It was simple, really, but in its simplicity, it was everything. A moment of connection that felt as though it had been years in the making. I knew I had to see her again. I sent her a message a few days later, tentative but eager. It was something simple. "Would love to grab coffee again sometime this week." My heart was thudding in my chest as I hit send, but almost immediately my phone buzzed with her reply. "Definitely. How about Thursday afternoon?" I couldn't help the smile that crept across my face. It was strange, this feeling of anticipation, of hope. I hadn't realized how much I had longed for someone like this. Thursday arrived, and I found myself walking to the same cafe, my pace quickening with each step. I didn't know why it mattered so much, why this one meeting felt like it could be a turning point in my life, but it did. Maybe it was because I was finally starting to feel like I was moving forward, not just existing, but living, and she was a part of that. When I walked into the cafe, I saw her sitting at our usual table by the window, her gaze fixed on the street outside. She didn't see me at first, but I noticed the slight way her shoulders tensed when she sensed me approaching. The way her head turned to meet my eyes felt like a small miracle, like she'd been waiting for me without realizing it. "Hey," I said, my voice warm, a little breathless. "Hey, you!" She smiled, and it felt like something in me unknotted, like the first moment of peace I'd had in a long time. We both sat down, the same comfortable silence between us, but this time it wasn't awkward. It felt natural, like we had done this for years. "How's the week been?" she asked, picking up her coffee and blowing on it gently. Her eyes were soft, but there was a spark there, something that made me believe in the possibility of more than just coffee dates. "Busy," I said, a small chuckle escaping me. "But good. It's strange, you know. I've been getting back into the rhythm of things, and it's like I've forgotten what it's like to be present, to just focus on what's happening now." She tilted her head, a knowing smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "It's funny how we get so caught up in the past or the future that we forget how to live in the moment. But I don't know. There's something about you that feels different. Her gaze lingered for a beat too long, and it made my heart skip. How so? I asked, leaning in just slightly, curious. Her words felt like a puzzle I wanted to solve. I don't know, she said softly. It's like you're awake in a way that I haven't seen in a long time. I guess. You remind me that life is about the little things, about not missing what's in front of us. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, a realization that hit me like a tidal wave. It wasn't just the connection between us. It was how alive I felt in her presence. It was as if, just by being near her, I was able to unlock pieces of myself that I had buried. And the thought of losing that, of going back to a life without this newfound understanding of who I was terrifying. I think it's you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You're the one who's reminded me how to see again, how to feel again. She blinked, clearly caught off guard by the honesty in my words, but there was a depth in her eyes that spoke volumes. For a moment, we simply held each other's gaze, the silence stretching out between us in a way that felt almost sacred. Then, slowly, she reached for my hand across the table, her fingers brushing mine in a soft, tentative touch. The sensation of her skin against mine was electric, like a spark igniting within me. It wasn't just a touch, it was a promise, a moment of recognition that we had both been searching for something, perhaps unknowingly, and we had finally found it in each other. I didn't expect this, she said quietly, her thumb tracing the back of my hand in slow, deliberate circles. I didn't expect to feel this way, but I'm glad I do. My heart pounded in my chest as I met her gaze, my own fingers curling around hers. Me neither, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. But I'm glad too. I'm glad we're here right now, just us. And in that moment, the world outside faded away. There was no past, no future. There was only the present, the warmth of her hand in mine, the quiet hum of the cafe, the unspoken understanding between us that this was something worth pursuing. Neither of us said much more that afternoon, but we didn't need to. Sometimes words aren't necessary. The next few weeks felt like a delicate dance between what was, what could be, and what we were slowly becoming. It wasn't rushed, wasn't forced. It was as though time had slowed, giving us space to explore this newfound connection without any urgency. Each meeting, each quiet moment shared, built layers upon layers of something that felt steady, real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not just in passing, but for the person I truly was. The parts of me I'd hidden, the ones that had been too tender to show anyone. We continued meeting at the same cafe. But there was something different now. The way we greeted each other, the casual touch of hands as we sat down. Her eyes, always so full of warmth, now seemed to shine with something deeper, something that mirrored what I felt. Our conversations were effortless, drifting between light-hearted banter and moments of quiet intimacy. We shared our pasts, our secrets, the things that had shaped us into who we were. And in doing so, we unraveled together, piece by piece. But there were moments, fleeting, brief, that I couldn't shake. The silence between us wasn't always filled with comfort. There were times when I would catch her looking at me with a sort of question in her eyes, as if she were trying to read something I wasn't yet ready to share. I caught myself hesitating when she asked about my past, or when the conversation veered too close to subjects I'd locked away. I could feel myself inching toward a point where I had to confront the reality of my life before all of this. The before her, the years of quiet turmoil and disillusionment. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to let her see all of that yet. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself standing in front of her apartment building, looking up at her window. It was a modest place, the kind of home that exuded comfort and simplicity. Nothing extravagant, nothing ostentatious, just a space where life could happen. I had messaged her earlier to ask if she wanted to grab dinner, but I hadn't heard back. It wasn't like her to leave me hanging. I felt a twinge of worry that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just busy. Still, something gnawed at me, pulling me to her doorstep. When I rang the bell, I waited, my heart thumping. The minutes stretched longer than they should have, the quiet of the evening settling around me like a blanket. Then, the door finally opened. Her face was soft, but there was an unreadable expression in her eyes. "Hey," she said, almost too casually. "What's up?" I couldn't place it. There was something off about the way she spoke, like the air between us had shifted. "I was hoping we could grab dinner. I just thought I'd check in on you." Her lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just a long day. Maybe another time?" My gut twisted. There was something in the way she said it, the distance that lingered in her voice. She stepped back, as if trying to pull away without quite knowing why. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice quiet. "You seem off. If something's going on, I'm here." She hesitated for a beat too long, her eyes darting to the side before meeting mine again. Then, with a soft sigh, she stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. "Maybe we should talk." I followed her into the apartment. The familiar comfort of the space not enough to erase the unease that had settled in my chest. She led me to the couch, where we sat side by side, an awkward distance between us now. I could feel the space she had created without even realizing it, the invisible barrier that had shifted between us. "Talk about what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if searching for something, some answer, some sign that I could fix this, whatever this was. "I've been thinking a lot," she said slowly, her words carefully chosen. "About us, about everything." I swallowed, unsure of what I was hearing. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I don't know. I've enjoyed the time we've spent together. I really have. But I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, for something serious." My chest tightened. The words felt like a punch to the gut, unexpected and sharp. "Serious?" I repeated, the word tasting foreign in my mouth. What do you mean exactly? We've been taking things slow. I thought we were just getting to know each other." "I know," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It's not you. It's just, I don't know if I'm capable of being what you need. I have my own stuff, my own past, and I'm not sure I can give you what you deserve. You deserve more than someone who's still figuring things out." The weight of her words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come.